On the bench of nearly every serious electronics lab on Earth sat one green-screened name, Tektronix. By the end of the 1960s, it owned roughly 3 of every 4 oscilloscopes sold, about 75% of the market for a machine it had all but invented. Then, it lost the crown. So what beats a company that makes the best version of the one instrument its whole industry cannot do without? The partnership behind that name was struck 9 years before the company existed, in a Portland radio shop. In 1936, Jack Murdock ran an electrical appliance and radio repair store and needed a technician. On a mutual friend's word, he took on Howard Vollum, a fresh Reed College physics graduate, whose senior thesis that same year was a new kind of cathode ray oscilloscope. Murdock had the money and the market instinct. Vollum had the physics. Vollum kept his own repair bench in the back of the shop and built scope prototypes there, rent-free for years, until the war pulled the two of them apart. The habit that would build the crown was already forming in that back room, the same habit that would one day refuse to let it go. It was the war that taught Vollum the central trick. He served as a U.S. Army Signal Corps officer from 1942 to 1946 in England and New Jersey, working on artillery fire control radar, and came home with the Legion of Merit. Radar and the oscilloscope are cousins. Each puts a cathode ray tube at the center of a person trying to read a signal too fast to see. And the idea of triggering had roots in that wartime radar work. Vollum, who had been building CRT scopes since boyhood, championed it. So when 4 of them, Vollum, Murdock, Miles Tippery, and Glenn McDowell, reunited in Portland in December 1945 and put in $20,600 apiece to start a company called TechRad, renamed Tektronix within a year, they were not starting from nothing. In 1946, Vollum built the world's first triggered sweep oscilloscope, a circuit that locks onto a repeating electrical signal and freezes its waveform on screen instead of letting it roll past. Before the trigger, a fast signal was a smear of light. After it, the signal sat still and could be measured, and the post-war boom in radar, television, and the first computers ran on that new ability to see electricity clearly. A man the war had trained to catch a racing signal and hold it steady had built the machine an empire would rest on. The Model 511 carried that trigger into production in 1947, and the catalog that followed reads like the history of the instrument itself. The 545, the 7000 series, and in 1964, the 564, the world's first mass-produced analog storage oscilloscope, a scope that could hold an image of the waveform after the signal itself was gone. The company moved to Beaverton in 1959 and kept climbing. In March 1965, it also reached across the Pacific, forming Sony Tektronix, a 50-50 venture with Sony to build oscilloscopes in Japan, a marriage to Japanese electronics that would run some 37 years. By 1969, sales reached $148 million, the year of that 75% share. 2 generations of engineers, from the vacuum tube years to the microprocessor years, learned the trade with one of those screens at their elbow. They trusted the machines the way a carpenter trusts a level. Hewlett-Packard gave that dominance its shape. HP came into oscilloscopes in the 1950s, by the Tektronix Museum's own telling, after Tech canceled its manufacturer rep contracts to sell direct, and spent the next few decades throwing scope after scope at the leader. Tektronix matched virtually every HP move within about a year, catalog leapfrogging catalog, spec by spec. Decades of that duel trained the company to define danger as one thing only: a rival's better analog scope. It learned to watch for the threat there, and to watch nowhere else. Inside the walls, engineering came first, and the company treated its engineers accordingly. It had been built on an engineer's invention and run in an engineer's image, with the analog circuit at the center of the craft. Vollum and Murdock ran the place as something close to a profit-sharing utopia. Roughly a third of pre-tax profit was handed back to employees in semi-annual lump sums, large enough in the boom years to nearly double a worker's take-home pay. People bought cars with those checks and put money down on houses. The staff called it Christmas in July. Engineering kept no time clocks. People set their own hours and drifted back after dark to chase an experiment, and everyone went by first name, the chief executive included. He was just Howard. Even the ground was communal. In 1956, the employees' own retirement trust bought the 313-acre Beaverton campus and leased it back to the company. This was the paradise a later decade would have to dismantle, and some historians argue the very comfort that made change so hard to imagine. For 25 years, the two founders held. Then one of them met the one signal no instrument he had ever built could hold still. Jack Murdock was a flyer. The company newsletter had run a note about Jack's new plane as early as 1955, and on Sunday, May 16, 1971, he was at the controls of a Piper Super Cub seaplane on the Columbia River near Maryhill, Washington. Extra fuel tanks fitted into the wings had left the plane top-heavy, and in high winds it flipped while still on the water. A passenger, Naomi Hamblin, swam for shore. Murdock, roughly halfway in, turned back toward the overturned plane, and the current pulled him under. His body was never recovered. Clark County Superior Court declared him legally dead on June 11th. He was 53. For Vollum, that single afternoon closed the founder's era. He had spent a lifetime building instruments that could catch anything fast enough to blur, and none of them was any use on the Columbia that day. Murdock's death left the company standing. The numbers still looked survivable, and the decisive mistake lay elsewhere. With Murdock gone, the board elected Earl Wantland president that October. Wantland would succeed Vollum as chief executive in 1974, with Vollum moving up to chairman. The professional management era, the one that would soon spread Tektronix across graphics terminals, printers, broadcast gear, and workstations, opened in the same year the businessman drowned. Vollum himself stayed on, chairman and then elder statesman, until a stroke took him in early February 1986 at 72. Forbes had estimated his Tektronix stock alone at around $220 million 2 years earlier. Murdock had never married and had no children, so his fortune had nowhere to go but outward, a fact that would matter more, in the end, than almost anything on the company's books. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the circuits a scope existed to test went digital, and the scope had to follow. A digital scope captures a signal as numbers in memory. A computer can store them, compare them, pass them on. The analog machines Tektronix had perfected drew a beautiful trace on phosphor and kept the signal to themselves. The company's best at memory, processors, and software were suddenly playing on the analog master's home field. Test equipment was fusing into integrated systems, instrument, computer, and software sold as one, while low-cost competitors, many of them from the same Japan where Tech had been building scopes for years, came in under the premium American price. Tektronix's mastery lived in the hand-tuned amplifier and the perfect trace, the very skills the shift discounted. Its answer was to spread out into workstations, broadcast gear, printers, and graphics terminals. And it arrived late to the new fights that mattered most. Tektronix did build digital scopes. In time, very good ones. Through the 1990s, the company fielded a genuinely competitive line of TDS digital storage oscilloscopes. And it invented the digital phosphor oscilloscope, a digital instrument that brought back the intensity-graded, watch-it-live feel of the old analog storage tube and even added a dimension plane digital scopes had thrown out. How often a signal returns to each point on the screen? Those instruments, though, belonged to the 1990s. The erosion had shown up a decade earlier, and in a cheaper corner of the catalog. Graphics terminals sounded the first alarm. Tektronix held 51% of that market in 1979. It entered color terminals about 3 years late, and watched its share fall to 26% by 1983. Half the share gone in 4 years, traced to a 3-year delay. The lead had come from being first with the finer instrument. Color terminals rewarded whoever shipped fastest. In 1982, competitors began shipping integrated computer-aided engineering systems, CAE workstations, machines that let circuit designers build and test a design in software before any hardware existed. The engineers those machines were built for were the same engineers who kept a tech scope on the bench, and the direction those machines pointed, design moving into software, was the direction the whole industry was walking. 2 years passed before Tektronix formed a systems division in 1984. It bought a company called CAE Systems in early 1985, shipped a workstation of its own in the mid-1980s, then within months flipped the plan from hardware to software. In 1988, it sold the entire CAE operation to Mentor Graphics for $5 million. There is a private sting in that name. Mentor Graphics had been founded in October 1981 by 3 men who had just walked out of Tektronix: Tom Brugger, a tech software engineering manager, Jerry Langler, who had run a tech marketing group, and Dave Moffenbauer, tech's manager of operations analysis, on about $3 million of venture money. Tektronix lost the CAE war, and it lost that war to a company its own former engineers had built, then paid to hand them the wreckage. Estimates of what the detour had cost ranged from $150 million to $225 million, a 9-figure tuition bill paid by a company that had spread itself across too many markets to move fast in any one of them. The bill came due in fiscal 1988, the first annual loss in the company's history, $16.7 million. Fiscal 1990 was worse, a $92.5 million loss, most of it restructuring charges. The top of the company churned with the numbers. David Friedley took the presidency in November 1987 and was gone by March 1990. Robert Lundin and William Walker stepped in to run operations in 1990. Jerome Meyer was hired that October. By 1992, the president was Delbert Yocham, lately of Apple. 4 changes at the top in 5 years, each one inheriting the same unsolved question. From a peak above 24,000 U.S. employees in 1981, the payroll fell to about 12,000 by the end of 1991, 12,000 jobs gone. And in a company town, every absence had a name and a neighbor. 1993 brought another cut of roughly 8% and a $55 million net loss. The lead was thinning with the payroll. By the company histories that have tracked it, the 75% of 1969 had become 57% by 1992. Still the biggest share in the business, though now a lead it had to defend. The scopes on the benches kept working. The company behind them kept shrinking. In another sense, though, it was multiplying. As the payroll fell, tech engineers scattered and started companies of their own. By one count, some 300 firms traced their roots to Tektronix, which is why it is remembered as the original tree of Oregon's Silicon Forest. Floating Point Systems, and later Lattice Semiconductor, grew up around the tech alumnus Norm Winningstad. Planar Systems took on flat panel displays. Pixelworks came later still. The empire was contracting and dispersing at once, reseeding a whole regional industry out of its own restless engineers, one resignation at a time. Tektronix spun off Merix, its printed circuit board business, in 1994, and later sold Grass Valley, its broadcast unit. A 1999 restructuring split the company, and the color printing division, the Phaser solid ink printers, went to Xerox in a $925 million deal completed in January 2000. What remained was the business the founders had started with: test and measurement. The slimmed-down company found its footing, taking in just over $1 billion in revenue in fiscal 2006. On November 21, 2007, Danaher Corporation bought it for $285 billion, $38 a share, ending just short of 62 years as an independent company. When Danaher spun off Fortive in 2016, Tektronix went with it. The name is still over the door in Beaverton, still on benches in working labs around the world. The engineers, technicians, and radio amateurs who came up on a Tektronix scope can still buy a new one. About 3,000 people work there as of 2023, an eighth of the 1981 payroll, while the hundreds of firms its engineers had seeded went on growing without it. The decisive failure was never a boardroom vote. It was a standing decision, renewed quietly year after year, while the ledger still read as safe, to stay the master of the analog craft in a decade that was going digital. Tektronix won every fight it could see and lost the one it would not look at. From that seat, each year the safe move was the one that had always worked, and on its own, every year's choice was defensible. Added together, those choices cost the company its lead. And the proof was the digital scope Tektronix could build all along and shipped a decade after the decade that needed it. Jack Murdock's fortune, the one with nowhere to go, became the M.J. Murdock Charitable Trust, chartered in 1975 out of an estate of roughly $91 million. It has since given away more than $1.5 billion across Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington, and ranks today among the largest private foundations in the Pacific Northwest. The businessman who drowned in 1971 still quietly outfunds most of what the company he helped start is now worth. The moat around that lead had been world-class analog engineering, and for 3 decades it held. When the ground shifted to digital, that same moat hardened into an anchor. Howard Vollum had spent his life learning to freeze a racing signal on a screen. The world that signal moved through kept moving, and it took the company with it. The men who froze signals for a living could not freeze a river, and they could not freeze the thing they had taught the world to catch, which still moves through every lab that ever held one of their machines. If you want more stories like this one, the names that were the best in the world at one thing until the world moved on,